The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. The key to the Canadian economy is in the hands of First Nations, says Christy Smith and Michael McPhie in their book Weaving Two Worlds. It's a guide to economic reconciliation. According to Smith, the intent of the book is to help First Nations, governments, and companies work together in the development of natural resources. McPhie says, we believe the resource sector and the people within it have a meaningful role to play in advancing reconciliation. Done right, the outcome will be greater social, environmental, and economic well-being for all. One court decision after another has been shaping the way Canada can and does develop its resources. According to Smith and McPhie, now is the time to create opportunities that provide First Nations access to the economic opportunities that will create ownership, employment, funds for education, and will combat poverty. I invited Christy Smith and Mike McPhie to join me for a conversation that matters about the path forward together. Welcome.
Great to be here.
What was it that inspired you to write this, or what I believe has been a long overdue book? Like, what were the factors that came together that you said, yeah, we got to put this down so that other people, number one, recognize the importance, but here are also the steps that you need to take to be able to have meaningful conversations?
Would you like to start?
Sure. I would say COVID.
Yeah,
The great unifier. Yeah.
COVID had something to do with it, for sure.
No, I think it was really led by Mike's initiative. And I just kind of jumped in and supported on the indigenous voice of the book. And so you might want to tell the story of how you came to roll the book out.
Well, yeah, and I started this work early in COVID. We all had a bit of time at home, and thought it's something I always wanted to do. And I worked around the mining sector and the resource sector for about 25 years, and have, through personal experience and efforts over that time, recognized that you can't even begin to move in direction of developing resources without full participation of Indigenous peoples. And it's the right thing to do. It is the necessary thing to do, and the regulatory and court cases have all reinforced that idea. And as beginning to start telling those stories, I thought, well, Christy, who's been a friend and a professional colleague of mine for a number of years, and we're in partnership together in a company called Falkirk, we thought, well, what better way to do it than having a non-Indigenous, Indigenous voice talking about these issues, not one or the other, but doing it together, because at the end of the day, that's what makes it work.
So, Christy, you brought forward your own life experience that leads you to the point where you are in helping to work with companies that, they're navigating the process of getting development permits and agreements with communities and so on. Why was it so important that you also made sure that you shared what your cultural path was to today?
Yeah, I should, I guess, explain, we come from a very oral storytelling culture, and so to actually translate into a written form was super intimidating for me, I have to say. But it was important to also explain where we're from, who we're related to. Those are things that are embedded in not only myself and my family, but our culture. And be able to tell the story along the way. I think it makes more sense to have personal stories in a book like that, to share experiences, and so other people can feel like they're not alone. A lot of times we get phone calls, and we were just on a call this morning where there was an individual that is going through the motions of trying to connect the nations with the proponent and having it be a good relationship, and sometimes you feel very alone in that space. And so I wanted to make sure that the stories and Mike's stories both told that story of the process and the journey, and that this is happening. People are coming up with innovative solutions we should all share, and this was just part of our sharing.
But it's common practice within Indigenous communities that you introduce yourself as, I am the son or daughter of, on my mother's side, on my father's side, and so on, because that gives a sense of background and where there are values. And if and I got the feeling when I was reading the book that you were saying, I'm doing this so that you understand this is a process that you have to bring forward if you're non-Indigenous and you want to relate to your Indigenous partners. And so did you feel that it was important that you also share that same background?
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting because I've worked my whole career in the corporate sector, and I've seen good and bad, and I've seen folks that, say a CEO coming out from Toronto books an hour between 11 and 12 to have a meeting with the First Nations community, right? And maybe that meeting gets delayed because of something happening within the community, and I can see the impatience and everything coming from a certain individual because they're like, well, I've got an 11 to 12 and I'm going to work it through. But what's really necessary is slowing down a little bit and recognizing that it's a real privilege to be invited into a territory that has been home to people for thousands of years. And you want to develop those resources and create jobs and economic development. That's all great, right? It's awesome. It's what creates our society. But if you don't take the time to sit down and actually understand somebody's story, or offer your own, like, why are you there and who are you and what are your values and will you be here tomorrow, or are you just going to show up, do the deal and move on, which happens a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And it puts a real obligation, I think, on industry to be honest with what you know and what you don't know, but also make commitments to the extent that you're able to, right? But be honest when you're not able to. Like, it forces us all into a bit of uncomfortableness in the sense of you got to be really open, because what I have learned humbly is, and I don't want to make any generalizations, but my experience has been Indigenous people will take the measure of the person and their story and where they come from and will hold you to your word. And that forces us to be real. And that isn't always where everybody comes from.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. I remember having a conversation with Chief Joe Alphonse of the Silcotin. And I said, so somebody goes, okay, we've identified a project that we think is interesting. How do I start? And he said, well, it could start with a phone call.
Yeah.
It's not like we're talking about that's that complicated. But embedded in all of that is I have the feeling that there has to be this measure of respect. Yeah. We're dealing with one another respectfully. And I see that in your book. You emphasize that to quite a degree. Without it, you can't do anything, can you?
No, and I think sometimes people make things too complicated, right? And at the end of the day, you want to reach out and you want to say hello, just do it. I think there's this fear of rejection in some cases from proponents before they even get to picking up the phone and saying hello. Mm-hmm. So I think there's things to be learned on multiple sides of building this relationship, and then really that proponent needs to take time to understand the community and what they're facing. And back to Mike's comment about somebody rolling in and rolling out, I think it's more honorable if the CEO says, I only have an hour, but I'm going to dedicate this person to build this relationship, and I'll be popping in when I can. That is more honorable than just going in and going out and not having somebody build that relationship, right?
Right.
And you know what Christy's taught me over the years, and we spent a lot of time working with proponents, is it's okay to ask, right? It's okay not, because I think we tend to, there's almost an academic institution around how to do engagement. But at the end of the day, and there's some really important methods and approaches, and there's structure for sure, but part of it is to ask the community, because one of the things that Christy talks about is pan-Indianism, where you people, there's 600 plus nations in the country, and every community is different, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't generalize, but what you can do is when you sit at the table is ask, okay, well, how would you like this conversation to go? What is it what is it that's important to you? What matters in your community? And it's funny how we don't always take time to do that, you know. And,
well, that takes a touch of humility.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
You know, you have to say, I don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
As you're speaking, I recall a great conversation that I had with Perry Bellegarde when he was the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And he said to me, you know, it's about building relationships. Because if you can't build a relationship, you can't build anything.
No.
And so in some ways I go, okay, somebody might be watching this going, well, you're telling me that's all there is to it? There's a lot more, isn't it? It becomes quite complex. What are some of the complexities that people need to be aware of when they say, okay, I want to engage with this First Nation because we want to develop a mine, or we want to work with you in the development of some other natural resource project?
I think some of the complexities, oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's one of those words, complexities, yes.
Complexities that we're seeing today is the fact that, you know, we've come out of COVID. We really are in an opioid crisis, like across Canada and specifically in indigenous communities. And the chief and council that are elected, that's their responsibility as well as the community. And so we may be, or as a proponent, you may see them wanting to like have some conversation and this needs to be done within this schedule and et cetera. But there's so much more going on a community level that's not seen or maybe not heard. That sometimes it seems like the Indigenous community is not engaging and does not want to be engaged, but really they do. They just have the community to take care of. And I think that's really complicated in that, you know, for the company wanting to move something forward, for the nation wanting to be involved but having to manage personal things, and to build that relationship in the midst of all of that, right?
Yeah, to take on that responsibility. I can see somebody going, huh? But all I want to do is do business. And so
there's a lot more. And you know, the other thing I would add to that is the history really matters, right? Like one of the stories we start out in the book is kind of talking about our resource history that we can be really proud of, right? As a country, it's built the railways, the ports, the cities, the well-being that so many of us enjoy. But it came at a cost to a certain degree, and a lot of, in particular, infrastructure and resource projects weren't done with the consent or even engagement with nations. And so, and this history is recent. This isn't hundreds of years ago. In many respects, like it's quite interesting as you do the research on this, like one of the Williston Dam, for example, up in Central British Columbia, you know, BC Hydro offered an apology for the displacement of Indigenous people, I think maybe 10 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, like 50 years after they built the dam.
And the displacement and the movement of people, like, so, and the reason that's important is, and there we give a few examples of those, is when, so say I'm a CEO of a mining company or a development company or whatever, and I go into that community and I want to talk about all this great opportunity and jobs. Well, the history of the displacement and the things that happen are not a distant memory. These are things that have affected their community today. And so if sometimes proponents don't encounter trust early on, they got to recognize that there's a whole bunch of people that have been coming here making promises or not even talking to them for decades before. So you have to be, patience is important, commitment's important, and just recognizing that you're part of a long history of folks that have shown up at the door and said they're going to do all these things, right? And it hasn't always worked out very well.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So we're in an environment now, especially post-Silcontine, where we all know that there has to be not just consultation and consent, but really we're working in partnership. For a number of First Nations, they're only just starting to enter into some of these complex kinds of agreements. How incumbent is it upon the companies that are coming there that they also help First Nations, you know, community councils and so on to develop the resources that the council needs so that they can be appropriately informed to negotiate the best possible deals? Christy. I see you nodding.
Well, and I think we need to take a step back, actually, in that not all nations want to be involved, right?
True.
And so we have nations that, you know, want to gain some economic benefit from the project, but may not want to participate because of various reasons that may go against their own personal beliefs and laws. And then there's nations that have chosen to participate in different forms. And so I just wanted to make sure that I think what I see across the board is it's not necessarily sometimes capacity, it's also got to fit within their community values. And that's a really important thing to understand. And so when a company comes in and they're like, well, you can make this money and this is your benefit, there's a real tie to that for sure, because it feeds into social programming that are not funded well on the reserve or in the communities. But there is also a give and take there, and they have to determine if that money's worth supporting something that may not align with their values. So there's really a mixed bag, I think, of nations across Canada and how they're approaching how they want to participate, and I think that's really fair.
Yeah, and one of the things that which is really fascinating going through this, because I've been around this stuff a while, is how recent a lot of these stories are. So when you look at LNG Canada and the work that's gone into the Haisla and things like that, you look at some of the benefit agreements and partnership agreements and equity agreements and things like that that have been happening in the mining sector, like or some of the real estate development. Like, a lot of this stuff is really current. Like, it was one of the most amazing things when we started looking at it. We finished with a bunch of case studies of different examples. They're all like 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. They're not, so we're kind of making this up, right? And the communities, some are engaging, some aren't. Some of the partnerships, there's examples, things that haven't worked well. But the key thing is to learn from those examples, and because the opportunity is extraordinary. But not every one of them is perfect, right? So we got to learn from those and build those and share experiences, like Christy was talking about when we started.
You remind me of something that Els Ross once said when somebody said to him, well, I don't understand it. Like, that nation over there, they like it. And he goes, so?
Yeah.
He says, that's like me saying to you, how come you disagree with the Premier of Alberta? You're both provinces.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, what other are sort of key essential elements that organizations and individuals have to keep in mind as you say you engage, there is agreement, then you start to move forward? I know you talked about patience, but that would be one element.
I think listening.
Yeah.
There's a technique to listen and actually really listen, and it's a really hard technique to actually train yourself in, because we're always listening to respond. I'm sure you do this because you're thinking of your next question and how that rolls. And but to genuinely listen and not have to respond and take it all in and learn from what you're being told and shared, the stories that you're being shared with, I think that is a key thing that people aren't naturally good at. I mean, even myself, I practice that on an ongoing basis because it requires practice, because we're so used to like knowing what to say next and how to respond and how you want to participate, or telling a story, how that relates to you, which isn't appropriate either. And so I think the listening element is fundamental, and that's the beginning of trust, which is key.
And in the book, our first chapter, after kind of an introduction, our first chapter is called Self-Reflection, right? And it's funny because I've worked around a lot of sort of A-type CEOs, people deal with, folks all my career, right? And you sit in a room with a board, and we've done this with some of the bigger corporations in the country and smaller companies as well. And you sit and you start talking about things like white privilege or inherent unconscious bias. Like, these are not things that are typically in that, until more recently, in that conversation, and not everybody's comfortable with it. And in fact, it took me a while as a like, whoa, what biases am I actually carrying into these conversations? But we all have them, right? And they're part of our growing up and our learning and examples that we've been shown. But the interesting thing is we see more Indigenous entrepreneurs, people that are lighting things on fire, young people, folks that are making difference in their, and people have more examples that they can look to. Maybe some of those negative biases that we have from previous experience, maybe those can start to chip away. But my reason for saying that is that part of the first point of this journey of reconciliation is recognizing your own personal biases, like sitting down and actually consciously thinking about them. Like when you see an Indigenous person, do you see a successful CEO in the future, or do you see something else? Like these are the things that we carry around inside us. And it's really important for people to take the time to reflect on those, because that is where genuine relationships come from. When you're sitting across the table and somebody sees you as treating them as a peer, as a colleague, as someone that can work together, that's really powerful. If they see something else where it's sort of arrogance or, oh, you're not going to really work hard, like negative stereotypes, people will pick up on that, right? And so I think a really important beginning point in this conversation is individuals and organizations, but individuals and particularly leaders taking the time to understand who they are and where they come from, because you will then reflect that on the people that you work with.
So when you start to work your way through that, sorry,
No, I was
Christy,
just going to say I have an example of this, and it was quite humorous. It was about 3 months ago, anyways, where I was just having a conversation in my own community, and I was offered to job shadow if I wanted to on a project that happened to be related to the work we do. And kind of listened, and I was like, oh, okay, well, how much money are you going to pay for job shadowing? And it was like almost minimum wage. It was minimum wage, with a little bit more. But then I said, well, why don't you do the work and I'll review it? And that was kind of the turning point of like, we've like actually assumed that there's no capacity, right? We assume too much when we sit across the table of the level of education and things like that, and not everybody realizes that, okay, a large amount of us are well educated. We could probably do some of our members could do the work. So that was a really key insightful moment for me, that we still have a lot of work to do, especially in that observation and that assumption piece.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So, by working your way through the initial stages of the relationship and you develop it, as you're starting to move towards developing a project, you can get into some very tricky issues, legal issues. Like, what is the legal capacity of a First Nation to sign a deal with a corporation, the way that a corporation to corporation, most people don't realize that we've got competing laws that get in the way of allowing First Nations to become fully engaged. So how important, when you start to get into some of that tricky negotiation, where on either side, one side may not understand what the minefields that are in place might be. I just can't help but think that if you haven't established that base, you can't get through some of those other challenges.
Oh, it's so true. And it's like anything, right? Like if you're going into any type of a relationship, business relationship with someone that you trust, it tends to be a lot easier to work through tough stuff.
Right.
If it's an antagonistic relationship, people can go and when I watch companies, for example, challenging nations legally and doing big, the minute you end up in it's just like, it's like if you have a neighbor and you're going to fight them over something on your property line, it's never going to be easy, and you'll never it's so important to invest the time up front to build a relationship. Then you can work through the tricky stuff. I don't know if you agree, Christy.
Oh no, absolutely. And
and I feel that probably a number of First Nations leaders go, okay, you do recognize that there's boundaries around what I can and can't do. I actually need to have that relationship with you so that together we can work through this and make it work for everybody. So the benefit of creating these kinds of opportunities, in my intro, I said it helps to address a wide range of issues in communities. The one that I think that resonates with me the most is that you start to create opportunities for people to realize their potential because there is opportunity to express themselves. How important is this overall? And not for just people in First Nations, but collectively, that we find this path forward.
I think that one of the things I remember when you were opening that was resonating with me with the benefits that come into the community. I think sometimes there's still that assumption that the benefits are these are the benefits that the community wants. I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. But it's not necessarily what the community needs or wants, essentially. Like, we're too complacent to go, here's some jobs, here's some training, and yet maybe the community needs support to develop a mental health facility or and other things. And so I think going back just a few questions ago, but the aspect of listening and then finding out what the values of the community and where those needs and wants are, and actually lay those things onto the table aside from what's standard kind of in those opportunities, I think is going to be that next step and go farther.
So when you say that, I go, oh, okay, you're revealing my bias here, or what may look like my bias. But when I think about opportunities, I'm saying, okay, what does this community need so that people can feel that they can be themselves, that they can be whole, that they can be safe. And that's when people then start to emerge and realize their potential. And it may not be, as you say, it may not be a job, it might be something else. But I think that by coming together and working together, we can start to identify that, as you say, nation by nation, each individually.
Yeah, I think we need to be more creative in this space. And there's opportunity to. I mean, we're just sort of, like Mike said, I mean, when we started looking at case studies back in like 2020, 2019, it was a very different world. We could create an entire book on case studies of what has now gone really well over the last like 4 years. So I think we're going to start to see this creativity come out and innovative ways to make the agreements fit and not just have agreements in place.
Yeah, and just a quick comment. You know, totally agree with what Christy's saying, and the reality is, if you're in the resource, and this is really for the leaders in the resource sector, if you're in the space in a way, and you want to develop a project in Canada or really anywhere else in the world, I mean, Indigenous issues it's a global thing. Right. It isn't just a Canadian thing, although it's very front and center for a lot of us. There's huge opportunity, but there's a real obligation to invest in understanding, right? And it does take time. And just a really quick example is on the environmental assessment process in BC. So everybody talks about it takes generations, all this kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily need to, because in fact, there's a number of projects that have gotten through in 2 or 3 years, and there's lots of good examples. But the common thread through any successful project right now is the Indigenous relationships that have come forward. And the new legislation that's in BC in particular requires consensus at a bunch of different steps. So like, this is a real business fundamental now. This isn't just a nice to do thing. Like, you got to figure it out, or you're not even getting out of the gate. And I don't know if that's fully sunk in with everybody and what it actually takes to achieve that. Consensus doesn't mean you all agree on everything, but there's a path forward that you agree on. And it requires a lot of our leaders today to do it well.
Well, you're in the business of helping people navigate this path forward on a wide variety of different projects in different jurisdictions across the country. And your book is a magnificent guide to getting started and moving down the right path.
Thanks.
What's to both of you, what's the most important thing that you would like somebody to take away from having read the book?
I think it goes back to that listening thing.
Yeah.
Like, really fundamentally listening for the purpose of listening, not responding. That self-reflection piece. And that takes work as well. I mean, I know myself, I have privilege. I went to school. I'm successful in my career. There's a lot of, and I have to check myself at the door and remove all that when I'm entering into a space of building a relationship. So I think that piece is really important, and that's like the first step, and that's probably the most important to me anyways.
Yeah.
Mike?
I think there's tremendous opportunity, and people talk about the $1 billion opportunities and all these kind of things, but at the same time we need to work on ourselves and make sure that we're fully present in these conversations. And every little bit that you do is a good thing. You don't have to be perfect. Like, it's okay. Just start. Go in with good integrity, good intent, and my experience has been over my career is that good things will come from that. So come to the table with an open heart and an open mind, and I think you can create real opportunity.
Well, thank you for coming in and sharing your insights like this, but I also encourage anybody who's interested to get a copy of the book, Weaving Two Worlds. It's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Thanks.